welcome back to Arcanum Theurgy episode 4. I'm Dan Rasanowski.
Joseph Schaefer.
And today, as we talked about in our last episode, if any of you remember or care or whatever, we are going to talk about the cross and the four elements. So, Joe, if you want to start.
Thanks, Dan.
Of course.
First off, sort of like by way of introduction, as Sir Lowe points out in his Dictionary of Symbols, quote, "The complex symbolism of the cross neither denies nor supplants the historical meaning of Christianity. But in addition to the realities of Christianity, there are two other essential factors, that of the symbolism of the cross as such, and that of the crucifixion or of suffering upon the cross," unquote. So that just is kind of saying, we're not talking about necessarily the Christian cross or crucifixion. We're talking about just the cross.
Right.
So like
the symbol.
an intersection. Mm-hmm. And there are many crosses, different shapes, different, for instance, even if like something like the Christian cross, the fact that bar is higher on the longer vertical one, it means something different than if it was lower. Not necessarily inverted, but just where it's placed has a meaning. But we're going to be talking basically about what looks like the addition sign. Dan has some information on many different crosses, whereas eventually I'll be focusing more on Hermeticism, Alchemy. And just as a quick introduction to the actual cross, I just want to say that it's composed of two lines, a horizontal one, which is related to passivity and thus the feminine, or like that of a man who sleeps or is dead, and a vertical one, which intersects it, which is related to the phallus, activity, or as a man who is awake or conscious. And the cross is also related to the four elements, which we'll get into depth later. And just as a quote to sum up my introduction here before I pass it to Dan, Julius Evola writes in the Hermetic tradition, quote, "The cross, then, is the cross of the four elements, fire above, earth below, air to the right, and water to the left," unquote. Do you mind if I just, go into your cross stuff, and then when we get into the actual elements, I can just describe the symbols for the elements, if that sounds fine.
Yeah, that works.
All right.
That'll probably lead right into where I'm going to stop. So, as we said, the cross we're talking about is not the religious cross, not the crucifix, no Christianity, nothing like that. But in that same respect, it is an archetype found within Christianity. It is found throughout all cultures, most in a magical context. So it is the, in most cultures, it's the route to enlightenment. It is the inner solar power, if you will. It's an all-inclusive symbol, and it covers cyclic or vortex patterns, the sun god, the earth goddess, the life giver, the great tree, and the earth energy. So kind of going into the elements there.
There's
and
a
the
lot
energies.
of overlapping, yeah.
Yeah, it's so hard to, you're like, well, I want to talk about one and not me, but it's like you can't. And it's also kind of just interesting. A lot of people, I'm sure, don't know. I didn't know this until really digging deep. It is the symbol of the Aztec greater god Quetzalcoatl, which I'm sure everyone knows Quetzalcoatl. They've heard that name before.
Right.
The feathered serpent. I'm sure it's winged too. Maybe, I don't know. Also, again, in another culture, in most Scandinavian cultures, let's see here, what they do is they would put it on initiates. Around 100 BC, many cultures use it as a cross for initiates, placed on their chest to symbolize rebirth. And also, kind of in that, ancient Scandinavians would place them on graves to the of the elect, also using the crosses within the graves as boundary markers. So not only is the religious, spiritual aspects, but they would also be it'd be like a warning sign,
Okay.
plate, whatever. So that's all that. So it's seen in many, if not all cultures, in one form or the other. Like Joe said earlier, every culture isn't just one line with an intersecting line at the top like a crucifix. It varies from culture to culture. The line is moved up and down. Sometimes it's within another shape.
Yeah, or like bent bars, like a swastika.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or like an ankh. An ankh is
yes.
It's got a cross.
Oh, yeah, we could get into that one day. Well, maybe we could even talk about it just right now. Like, just a quick explanation. That, I believe... See, I didn't do research, but I know Evel has written about it in the Hermetic tradition, and I've also read elsewhere that it's kind of related to the idea of rebirth and like afterlife in a sense, because the circle is rising above. It's rising above something. It's almost like something rising out of the waters of like the prima materia.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I didn't write it down, but that's exactly what that is. It's a symbol of rebirth within Egyptian religion. Culture.
Yeah, an important cross. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that being said, it's everywhere. And then, of course, it being everywhere, it bleeds into alchemy, where it's extremely important. I would even say it doesn't bleed, it exists within it.
Yeah, it's very fundamental for understanding and being initiated into the meanings of many alchemical symbols. Mm-hmm. It's in so many metallic symbols. So also, kind of the metallic earth, metals... within alchemy, the cross is also associated with the 4 elements, so if you would... Perfect. I do have one more thing that I wanted to mention earlier.
Sure. About
crosses and like what we're talking about. So Oswald Wirth, in his book Hermetic Symbolism and its Relation with Alchemy and Freemasonry, points out the difference of the cross arranged as what we would recognize as the multiplication sign, so basically like just the addition sign tilted.
Right.
An X.
Mm-hmm.
So the tilted multiplication sign... sort of as a deeper meaning, Wirth calls this the Cross of Saint Andre, and says that it represents the meeting of 2 similar factors that are opposed to one another. So just another interesting sort of symbolism embedded in there. Now, that doesn't come up in alchemy, to my knowledge. I haven't come across it yet.
I haven't either.
But just something important, interesting, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the cross is linked with the 4 elements. And the 4 elements, being fire, water, earth, and air, have their own symbols too. Fire is just a upward triangle, nothing inside it, just a triangle. Water is a downward triangle. Earth is a downward triangle with a line going across it horizontally, kind of like cutting it. And air is an upward triangle with a line going through it, same way. There is also a 5th element. A 5th element is also expressed in the symbol of the cross. Evola writes that, quote, "The central point of the cross expresses the point of unity of the 4 elements, the originating superior and anterior to their 4 differentiations given up by the 4 directions. Thereby it expresses the quintessence, the incorruptible and simple principle that, according to the tradition, is the substratum, the principle of life and the nexus of reciprocal union formed by the 4 elements," unquote. He goes on further, saying, quote, "Here we must point out that, like the elements, the Hermetic quintessence, the equivalent of the Pythagorean Hokas, the Hindu Akasha, the Kabbalistic Avir, and the Taoist Chi, etc., is not considered a speculative abstraction or some contrivance of the, quote, physics, unquote, of yesteryear, but a reality to which corresponds a specific spiritual experience. And the symbolic central point of the cross, as soon as it is known to the magical hero and understood," says Della Riviera, "becomes the root and origin of all magic marvels," unquote. So again, kind of like what we mentioned in, I think, our first episode, is that it's to, initiates and people like Julius Evola and people who take these mysteries seriously, it's not just like a metaphor. It's not maybe just... It actually means something. It goes on to something that is to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I do have quite a bit on the elements.
As do I.
To go in depth here.
Yeah.
I suppose I could just kind of plow through it. Feel free to jump in, or if you have something that kind of relates,
I'll definitely...
But if it feels like it's just a solid thing unto itself, then we could go through years after this.
Absolutely.
So it shouldn't take too long.
No, yeah. Go right ahead.
So, in the introduction to The Alchemy Reader, the editor, Stanton J. Linden, mentions the elements in a section on alchemical principles and theories. Quote, he says, "Well into the 17th century, explanations of the natural origin of metals were largely Aristotelian, as set forth in meteorology. They were based on the theory of the 4 elements derived from Empedocles and Plato, the idea of a single underlying prime matter, like what is expressed in the circle or point. and vapors and exhalations, the moist and the dry as the parent principles of all things that were quarried in mind, unquote. So again, we see similar, like we were talking about, the point and the circle, and then in our last episode we pointed out that you can really only represent unity as the mathematical point, but it's indiscernible to us. So we represent it by the point in the circle or the intersection of the cross,
Gotcha.
which leads us into this episode. So Linden goes on, quote, "The four elements were regarded as different forms or appearances of an underlying matter or prima materia, from which all visible material objects are derived, each composed of a different combination of hotness, dryness, coldness, and moistness," unquote. For some broader context and the symbolic relationship here, Jabir ibn Hayyan, also known as Geber, and he also had someone. See, with Hayyan and Geber, there's pseudo Geber, who was, people think, another writer either after or concurrent with the Arabic Jabir ibn Hayyan, who just wrote under the Latinized pseudonym of Geber, so they call him pseudo Geber. But I believe this is from the actual Jabir ibn Hayyan, who was in like the late 8th or early 9th century. He had a sulfur-mercury theory in which sulfur is identified with fire and possesses the qualities of hotness and dryness, whereas mercury is identified with water, as we've pointed out before, and possesses coldness and moistness. Linden writes, quote, "These two principles, in the form of subterranean exhalations or vapors, the former male, the latter female, so this is coming up all the time, and if the conjunction occurs under proper conditions, the degree of heat within the earth is especially important. Metals are formed," unquote. Heat is something important, and Evola does talk about this later on in part 2 of the Hermetic tradition when he's talking about the royal art itself and like how to incorporate all these symbols and meanings into the act. So he'll talk about paying attention to like the heat of the blood, and such, so just kind of coming up again. Another sort of symbolic relations and greater context we get from Bernard, Earl of Trevisan, who I think is also known as Bernard de Treviso, whom Evola cites very often in the Hermetic tradition. This is from a 14th century work called A Treatise of the Philosopher's Stone. So Bernard writes, quote, "The subject of this admired science of Sol and Luna, or rather male and female, the male is hot and dry, the female cold and moist. And know for a certain that our stone is not compounded of any other thing, although many philosophers name several other things, of which they speak sophistically," unquote. So yeah, male, female, coming in again, like, you know, that's a very important duality to incorporate into this.
I definitely have,
and the union of the both, you know.
Exactly.
So Bernard goes on saying, quote, "The foundation of this art is the knowledge of the four qualities, and that in the beginning of the work, coldness and moisture have the dominion." So the female, lunar, sublunary. Mm-hmm. "For as Scotus saith," Scotus is Michael Scott, a 13th century scholar, magician, and alchemist. "As Scotus saith, as the sun drieth up the abundance of water in fenny and boggy places," so like the Nigredo burning down stage, "after the same manner our sulfur, when it is joined with its water or mercury, doth by little and little consume and drink up the same by help of the fire, and that by the assistance of the only living God," unquote. Linden explains in the Alchemy Reader that in the worldview of the alchemists, all sublunary substances are in a state of transformation and flux. This flux results from the imposition of different forms on the prime matter. And he writes, quote, "The idea is set forth memorably in Plato's Timaeus, where transformation is implicit in the four elements theory because of the convertibility of the elements that comprise all substances. Earth can be changed into water if its essential dryness is replaced by wetness, and coldness remains constant. Similarly, air could become fire if dryness came to replace wetness," unquote. I also, luckily and happily, stumbled upon some fragments from Heraclitus that speak in a similar way. In fragment 72, he says, quote, "It is pleasure for souls to become humid," unquote. And fragments 74 to 76 read, quote, The dry soul is the wisest and best, unquote. So the dry, fire, active, solar.
And you said the fire is the center of the cross, the center of the circle. That's where you want to be.
Well, the center of the cross is the quintessence.
Right. Oh, well, okay. So I'm letting my sort of thing come in there. Because I guess in alchemy it's a little bit different. But in mine... I'll get to it. I'll let you finish. Yeah.
Sure, that sounds good.
Yeah.
I'm basically done. I just want to make a quick note to say that, like, Plato and Heraclitus, they're not alchemists per se, but they're sort of like what was written in the Timaeus and the elemental ideas. Yeah, they're incorporated into the alchemical symbolism and ideas and such. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I'm basically done. I just have one quick note I'd like to add before we completely wrap up. So if you want to give us like a broader context and different interpretations and whatnot.
Sure. Of course, I have in alchemy the 4 elements, as Joe said, the elements of antiquity, as they are put. Earth, air, fire, and water are... their significance and permanence is obvious, but only to the enlightened.
Okay.
Or
the initiated, perhaps.
Yeah, the initiated. That's a very good way to put it. The elements, along with... the elements also have corresponding cardinal directions on the cross. With the cardinal directions, they also have the seasons of the year, the times of day, suits of tarot cards. So tarot cards, once again, coming in, and even archangels that personify them. So, therefore, it is a symbol that connects the outer and inner, the microcosm and the macrocosm.
Okay, right.
It connects the outer and inner worlds, reminding us that we are connected to the universe. We're never separated. So it is a symbol that means that we're connected. Yeah, I mean, to put it simply, it just means that we're connected to the universe. We're not some sort of separate entity that is completely
right, which is an important thing to. That goes kind of back to the Ouroboros. Mm-hmm. We're in this nature, so like in our processes, we're the snake eating its own tail. It's not a separate nature coming in.
Right, exactly. So, with that being said, I have the 4 branches of the cross, but I should say the 4 points of the cross, because each element and cardinal direction is represented by the ends of the cross, not necessarily the arms, which could mean a completely different thing. The top of the cross, north, is north, winter, night, earth, shield, and the archangel Oriel. And then I'll get into the meanings of each one, because I also have the meanings of like what that means in itself, because there's a whole description of it.
Okay.
So there's north, which is all that. There's south, which is also, again, south, summer, noon, fire, rod, Archangel Michael. Then east, which is the right point of the cross. East, spring, dawn, air, sword, Archangel Raphael.
Okay.
And then you have west, which is the left point of the cross. West, autumn, dusk, water, cup, which cup and chalice are a very important symbol.
Yeah, and those are on tarot cards, too.
Exactly, yeah, so super important, which people wouldn't, it's very unassuming, cup, whatever. But,
and even like the Holy Grail, like people, they kind of portray it as like some sort of goblet or cup or something.
Yeah, it's very goblet,
yeah. Goblety.
Goblety. So, autumn, dusk, water, cup.
Goblety gook.
And then Archangel Gabriel. Okay. So they each point has an element, and then each point also has a season, a time of day, an angel attached to it, or so on and so forth. But the meanings to those, which you pointed out earlier, it comes in again with the male and the female and the young and the that sort of thing. The meanings, north, top point of the cross. Excuse me. Top point of the cross is senior female. So it has to do with, experience, wisdom, caution, tolerance, patience, and all good qualities and highest level of human spirit. These are way longer, like really long, and I'm like, oh my god, I'm not writing this down. I'm not going to talk about it because I'll be here forever. So that's the crux of the meaning. And then there's south, which is senior male, commanding type, upholds conduct of group, makes rulings, keeps discipline, principal enlightener. There's east, which, again, that is the right side, the right point of the cross. Young and highly intelligent male person, sharp and keen mind and soul, prevents complacency and promotes activeness.
I've never heard any of these before. This is fascinating.
Yeah, that's what I said. I was like, okay.
Yeah. So did you have West still? Because I was going to ask you a question, but I'll let you finish.
Yeah, no, and the last one I have is West, which is young female. And then, again, I don't know if we've ever talked about it, but it seems that within all of this, in spirituality and whatnot, women are more in tune with spirituality and magic and energies.
Like the moon representing the occult hidden side of nature, capital N, and that being correlated with female femininity. So
exactly. So that being said, again, meditates powerful love and compassion throughout the group. So it's meditating. It's energy. Must be able to radiate happiness, cheerfulness, kindness, and good humor. Must keep in touch with the inner nature of the entirely sacred cup and chalice. I did not get anything on the cup and chalice because I figured that could be like a whole nother So I'm just like, but that is something that will be talked about. I'm sure it'll come up with any of this, and we'll talk about what the cup and chalice mean, especially in the tarot cards. And let's see here. Each point of the cross also can be, well, it's not also, it is associated with the following qualities. So the north point, the top, is health, wealth, and security. The south point is ambition and intuition. The east point is intellect and learning. And the west point is feelings and emotions. And the whole point of all of this, it seems to be when all these aspects are brought into balance, like everything I just talked about, when it's all brought into balance and you find that center
of the cross, the heart of your being.
Exactly. Within that, when you get that balance, the center of your being, the psyche of an individual, the inner solar power may be accessed, and then sometimes called the inner sun. And that's the purpose
which would be like the hieroglyph of the sun, which is the gold, so that really ties into the alchemy
everything, which is insane how it's just like there's nothing that's standalone.
No.
And the purpose of certain magical rituals in occultism, not necessarily all, but in certain magic rituals, as well as to raise one's awareness. So kind of with the alchemy, how the whole purpose is to turn that garbage, that lead, into gold.
Yeah.
Here, same concept, different, sort of a deal, I guess you could say. Okay. You want to balance all of that stuff perfectly to reach the inner center point, the inner sun, and achieve greater awareness, become a greater being.
Yeah, and there is a connection. We've probably pointed out before, but I mean, like, well, what I was going to ask you is where did you get a lot of this from, like Agrippa?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Mm-hmm. So because he's cited in Evoola's Hermetic tradition, So I mean, he's kind of saying, look, from this source we can understand this a bit more. So I mean, they're not like completely separate worlds. There's definitely overlap. Like I said before, I think in episode 1, a nice Venn diagram would probably show a liberal overlapping between occultism, hermeticism, alchemy.
Yeah, there'd be a ton. And then one example I drew a little picture of one ritual. So what it is, it's a circle. So going back to circles are important.
Yes.
You have a circle, and then within the circle there's an intersecting shape, a cross.
And so like kind of cutting it into 4 equal quadrants?
Exactly, okay. 4 equal quarters. And they each touch the edges of the circle. Again, that's important. They each touch the edges of the circle. And then what that does is each person is stationed in their corresponding quarter. So each person would stand in one quadrant. Within the center, the intersecting point, that is the solar power. And then before any of the ritual starts, it's each quarter is aligned to the cardinal directions of the earth. So it's set up very specifically. It's not just put it down anywhere. They have to, connect energies and make stuff.
Yeah, things have to be aligned.
Exactly. And then it was very hard to find stuff about what you do during the ritual, but the people, they stand in the quadrants. I'm sure there's some meditation. Aligning the thing, the cardinal directions with the earth is important. I'm not too sure about the details, but the purpose of this ritual is to connect one's inner and outer worlds. So I talked about that earlier, to reach the inner sun, as I said. So, yeah, if I ever dig any deeper and I find, like, maybe somewhere where they practice the ritual, I will talk about it more in depth, because it seems to be like that's really important, this particular ritual. But that's kind of how they set it up.
Okay.
So, yeah, and then also, I have some other symbols that can come across as, well, they don't come across as crosses, they are crosses in some way. Sulfur has crossing, intersecting lines. Mm-hmm. And then the Sun Cross, which is an Iron Age religious symbol, and neo-paganism symbol, which is just kind of what I just described with that ritual. It's a circle.
Like a cross, like a circle with
a cross
cut into quadrants.
Cut into equal quadrants. And then the Rosy Cross, which is a Rosicrucianism and Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
And I believe that's because, like, that comes from Rosenkreuz, and Kreuz is, like, German for cross.
Exactly. Yeah. You were very correct. And I was going to draw it. I have the drawings on a piece of paper, but the Rosy Cross was kind of crazy.
Is it like the Prince symbol?
Yeah, kind of. It was... it's not just two lines intersecting. Okay. It is two almost rectangular hourglass shapes intersecting right in the middle.
Oh,
it's got a lot of Hebrew. There's pictures and drawings and certain.
So they like piled it all on there.
Yeah, and it means.
I like the simple, intersecting of the passivity and the activity.
Exactly.
Like the addition sign.
Theirs has
so simple, so powerful.
Yeah, this one was not simple, and I was like, I'm not going to draw that because it's just. And then if I drew it, it would have been kind of garbage, and I wouldn't have been able to explain. Like, here's a, I don't even know what that. So
just didn't Google draw it.
Yeah, just Google it.
Yeah.
It's called the Rosy Cross, ROSY cross.
Okay.
So if anyone's curious, you can take a look at that. But that being said. Excuse me. I think that's everything that you would need to know about the cross. I don't know if you had anything to...
No, I think we're about good, and we could probably just wrap it up if you want.
Sure.
Just by way of saying, so how this will lead probably into our next episode, I think what you can expect is we're going to want to talk about... I know this would lead nicely into like salt... and
niter,
mm-hmm. and other symbols with crosses in them with relation to the circle, like vegetative, animal, mineral states, that type of stuff.
It's funny how this stuff just keeps.
Yeah, we're trying to have the most. Yeah, we're trying to have the most logical progression for you here,
and it seems to be making sense because each episode. It seems to reference what we talked about in the other episode and then combines it. Like we talked about the circle with a point, and now it's like the circle with the point and the cross.
Yeah. And then we could probably start delving... We can at least get into a little bit about sulfur and mercury because crosses are in their symbols and they're placed in certain locations for reasons. And then maybe after that, we'll just have to start doing episodes about, like, the big symbols like sulfur, mercury, water, and gold, and really get into just that stuff. But we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the next one, salt, niter, various associations with that, and yeah.
Yeah, so with that being said, thank you once again for tuning in to Arcanum Theurgy. This was episode 4 on crosses. So yeah, stay tuned for the next episode, and thanks for listening. I'm Dan Rastanowski.
Joe Schaefer.
And you guys take care.